Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. The flight deck of the IJN Akagi, 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Imagine the tension, the electric pulse in the air. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga clutched his flight roster, fingers still trembling from the adrenaline of his bombing run over Midway. Through the carrier's bridge windows, the deck below resembled a living, breathing organism. Type 99 dive bombers being hustled aside, Type 97 torpedo planes having their torpedoes swapped for 800-kilogram bombs, fuel hoses coiling across the deck like massive steel serpents, writhing under the frantic hands of the crew. In his pocket lay a letter to his wife, unfinished, the final line boldly claiming, "The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain." Could he have imagined in that heartbeat that American planes were already closing in on his position? Could he have foreseen that the next 11 minutes would decide not only the fate of 4 Japanese carriers, but alter the very course of the Pacific War? Could he know that everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed about carrier warfare, about American capabilities, about their own invincibility, was about to crumble in the time it takes to sip a cup of tea? Below, Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada moved with the precision of a man possessed. Aircraft mechanic, commander of the weapons changeover just ordered by Admiral Nagumo, he worked as if every second could mean life or death. They had drilled for this moment, switching from land attack to ship attack ordnance, but never under such frantic pressure, never with scouts reporting conflicting sightings, never with the gnawing sensation that the tide of battle was slipping through their fingers despite all evidence of Japanese dominance. At 10:20, the carriers were gods of the Pacific, their aircraft poised to annihilate what they believed to be the lone American carrier in the area. 11 minutes later, by 10:31, 3 of those carriers would be reduced to blazing coffins of steel, their decks ripped apart by American dive bombers that seemed to descend from the void itself. In that short span, the Pacific would reveal secrets of modern naval warfare that neither Navy fully understood until they unfolded in real time over its endless blue expanse. On that morning, the numbers seemed undeniable. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, the most formidable carrier strike force ever assembled. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with 248 aircraft manned by the most seasoned naval aviators on the planet. Veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, Darwin, and Ceylon, men who had sunk more Allied warships in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all previous conflicts combined. Across the ocean, Admiral Chester Nimitz had mustered 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the last barely seaworthy, hastily repaired in 72 grueling hours by Pawn 400 workers at Pearl Harbor, a job that should have taken 3 months. The Americans fielded 233 aircraft, most piloted by men who had never faced combat, many with fewer than 300 flight hours. Their torpedo squadrons flew the outdated TBD Devastator, scornfully nicknamed the TB Dead. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi had been certain, recording in his war diary, "The American Navy is a broken force. After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific." But certainty, as history would soon reveal, can be a fragile thing. They believed the war would be decided that day. They did not speak from bravado alone. Their record justified confidence. Only a month before, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first ever clash of carriers, they had sent the USS Lexington, America's second largest carrier, to the bottom while losing only the light carrier Shoho. They had struck Darwin with impunity, hammered Ceylon without opposition, and ranged from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean as if the Pacific were their private map. But what the Japanese did not know that morning would fill libraries. They were blind to a secret kept in the code rooms at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. American cryptanalysts had broken JN-25. They did not know that Admiral Chester Nimitz had read their operational orders, understood that Midway was their objective, knew the makeup of their force, and had concealed his carriers in ambush at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. Imagine yourself in the cockpit of a Kagazero. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a veteran, later admitted with the clarity of hindsight, "We operated under the assumption that surprise was ours. We believed the Americans thought we were coming for Hawaii or the Aleutians. We believed they had at most one operational carrier in the Pacific. Every single assumption, it turned out, was wrong, but they didn't know that until the metal and fire began to fall. Fate dealt another quiet hand. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of Pearl Harbor, lay ill with pneumonia in his cabin aboard Akagi. His absence from the bridge would prove decisive. Genda had been the lone voice among his peers urging that a standing reserve of aircraft remain armed for anti-ship operations. His stand was not doctrinal hair-splitting. It was an insurance policy against uncertainty. In his stead, Commander Tomotsu Oishi held the post, a man who neither shared Genda's instinctive caution nor his almost paranoid respect for American carrier capability. They also did not know that Yorktown was seaworthy. Naval intelligence had reported her heavily damaged to Coral Sea, a true statement, and estimated a minimum of 3 months to repair. What they could not imagine was that American shipwrights at Pearl Harbor had concentrated 3 months' work into 3 days. Welders working while the ship steamed, elevators mended as she raced toward Midway, a miracle of haste and will. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo launched 7 scout planes to hunt for American vessels. Even that number was a compromise. Doctrine demanded dozens of search aircraft, yet Nagumo hoarded his planes for the strike on Midway. Each scout traced a single line 300 miles out and back. Vast tracts of ocean were left unqueried. The most vital of these search lines, number 4 from the cruiser Tone, lifted 30 minutes late because of catapult trouble. One small mechanical failure would place Tone's scout over the American fleet at the worst conceivable moment for the Japanese. When those delayed scouts finally peered down, the decks below were not clear water, but a riot of activity. Aircraft being refueled and rearmed, workers weaving among planes like ants on a fevered mound. Petty Officer First Class Amari, an observer from the battleship Haruna, would recall later, "We flew our assigned line seeing nothing but empty ocean. We were trained to see what we expected," he said. Merchant ships, perhaps, even a cruiser. But nobody was looking for a force of carriers because nobody believed carriers were there. Darkness still clung to the sea when, at 4:30 a.m., 108 Japanese aircraft launched toward Midway. 36 Zero fighters, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Type 97 Kate torpedo planes, the latter carrying bombs in place of torpedoes. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike. His plane carried a radio whose words would soon set in motion a chain of fatal decisions. The Midway strike met resistance fiercer than anticipated. American fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and the more rugged Wildcats waited at altitude vectored by radar. Anti-aircraft fire from the island was intense and unnervingly accurate. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft and suffered 14 heavily damaged. More than the losses, it was Tomonaga's radioed warning at 7:00 a.m. There is need for a second attack wave that landed like a stone in the minds of Nagumo and his staff. Imagine being Nagumo at that instant. Over his shoulder, the sea bright with tracer, reports arriving in fragments. He held 93 aircraft in reserve, torpedo-armed Kates and armor-piercing equipped planes intended for ship attack. Yet from Midway, American B-17s were droning high-altitude, largely ineffective bombs onto his formation, forcing evasive maneuvers. Torpedo planes from the island had also made a clumsy, damaging run, proving Midway still had teeth. Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of Soryu advised plainly, "Sir, we should keep the reserve armed for ship attack. We have heard nothing from our scouts, but that doesn't mean there are no American ships. But pressure has a voice of its own." Nagumo, shaken by the intermittent attacks and influenced by Tomonaga's plea for reinforcement, chose at 7:15 a.m. to remove torpedoes and load bombs for land attack. That order opened the ship into a controlled chaos that would prove lethal. Think about the complexity of that switch. Each Type 97 Kate could carry either a Type 91 torpedo or an 800-kilogram land attack bomb. To change a plane's loadout required cranking it down to the hangar deck, hauling the torpedo off in special dollies, attaching a bomb on different fittings, altering the release mechanism for a very different ballistics profile, returning the aircraft to the flight deck, and then refueling for a mission with an entirely different endurance profile. It was meticulous, slow work, and deadly when done under fire. Aviation Ordnance Man Second Class Takeshi Maeda of Kaga later described what it felt like. "We worked like demons. Torpedoes were stacked on the hangar deck because returning them to the magazine took too long. Fuel hoses were everywhere. We were refueling aircraft while changing weapons, something strictly forbidden but necessary to save time. The hangar deck became a bomb with a lit fuse, but we didn't think about it. We had done this drill hundreds of times. On Akagi, complications multiplied. Type 99 dive bombers aboard could carry either 250 kilogauss general-purpose bombs for land or 242 kilogauss semi-armor-piercing bombs for ships. Different mounts, different fuses, different release settings. Bombs had to be swapped not only for size but for purpose. Each change a fresh choreography under pressure. At 7:28 a.m., as this frantic rearming continued and fuel hoses snaked like danger lines, Tone's delayed scout finally reached its turn point, and what it saw would arrive at the worst possible moment for the carriers that believed themselves safe. Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari was about to turn back when a flash of white on the horizon caught his eye, wakes slicing the ocean like ghostly fingers. His radio report was cautious, almost understated. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing Delwa 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. At 7:40 a.m., Admiral Nagumo received the message. 10 ships. Could be destroyers, cruisers, transports. Nothing that required the immediate attention of 4 Japanese carriers. He continued the frantic rearming for land attack, instructing the scout to confirm ship types and maintain contact. Then, at 7:55 a.m., a new message arrived, and it would haunt Nagumo for the rest of his life. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded the bridge, no carriers. The rearming could continue. Some officers allowed themselves small smiles. Here was an American surface force without air cover, perfect prey for the Kido Butai. But then, at 8:09 a.m., Reality hit like a hammer. Another message, correcting the first. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The Akagi's bridge erupted in controlled panic. One carrier. Even a single carrier altered everything. Nagumo's orders were instantaneous. Suspend rearming. Leave torpedoes on aircraft that still had them. Prepare to launch ship attack immediately. But the decks below were already a maze of chaos. Half the aircraft carried bombs that were not fused. Others had torpedoes partially mounted. Some planes were on the flight deck with bombs ready. Others sat in the hangar with torpedoes attached. To launch a coordinated strike, all aircraft had to be armed the same way, and that would take at least 45 minutes. Meanwhile, the returning Midway strike force was approaching, low on fuel, some damaged, all desperate to land. Navy doctrine was absolute: recover your aircraft first, then launch new strikes. To do otherwise would have meant losing dozens of planes and, more critically, their veteran pilots. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second fateful decision. Recover the Midway strike force first, then we will deal with the American carrier. Between 8:37 and 9:17 a.m., all four Japanese carriers focused solely on recovery. A delicate ballet of clearing the flight deck, turning into the wind, landing damaged aircraft first, then fighters, then bombers, immediately refueling and rearming as new planes were spotted for launch. Every move required precision, yet time had already run out. Because far to the east, at 7:02 a.m., Admiral Spruance on Enterprise had made a decision that would decide the day. Launch everything immediately at maximum range, without waiting to coordinate a textbook strike. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Air Operations Officer, protested, "Admiral, we'll be launching at extreme range. Many planes won't make it back." Spruance's answer was simple, almost prophetic. "We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their Midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable." The American launch between 7:02 and 8:06 a.m. was barely controlled chaos, the very sort that would have horrified Japanese instructors. Instead of coordinated squadrons arriving simultaneously, each unit launched as soon as it was ready, proceeding independently. From Enterprise, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet, 35 Dauntlesses, 15 Devastators, 10 Wildcats. From Yorktown, 2 hours later, 17 Dauntlesses, 12 Devastators, 6 Wildcats. By any conventional standard, this was a disaster. Squadrons became scattered. Fighters flew at different altitudes than bombers. Radio discipline collapsed. Navigation errors sent whole squadrons off course. Hornets fighters and dive bombers never even found the Japanese fleet, running out of fuel and ditching or limping back to Midway. Ensign George Gay, torpedo bomber pilot from Hornet's VT-8, later described the moment. "We launched knowing we probably wouldn't make it back. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, told us straight, 'We're going alone. We'll probably all be killed, but we're going to hit those carriers.' They flew off separated from their own fighters and dive bombers. Suicide, yes, but also duty." At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese planes from the Midway strike touched down, radar on Soryu detected incoming aircraft skimming low over the water. Waldron's VT-8, 15 obsolete torpedo bombers without escort, had found the Japanese fleet through sheer determination and brilliant navigation. The ensuing slaughter was immediate. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down. 29 of 30 aircrew were killed. Only Ensign Gay survived, clinging beneath his seat cushion in the water, witnessing what came next. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. and yet the sacrifice was far from meaningless. Every Zero had descended to sea level to engage the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers, forced into evasive maneuvers, could not spot aircraft ready for launch. Every lookout's attention was drawn downward, not to the sky. At 9:36 a.m., VT-6 from Enterprise arrived. 14 more torpedo bombers, also unescorted. They lost 10 of 14 planes without scoring a hit. At 10:00 a.m., Yorktown's V-3 joined the fray. 12 more torpedo bombers with a handful of fighters lost 10 out of 12, again with no hits. By 10:20 a.m., the last American torpedo bombers were either destroyed or fleeing. The Japanese carriers began recovering their Zeros, low on fuel and ammunition. Victory seemed absolute. No torpedoes had struck, and 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers lay in ruin. On the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally allowed himself a moment of relief. His operations officer reported crisply, "Sir, we can be ready to launch our strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes, all aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." Every deck was a hive of activity. Akagi had 40 aircraft on deck, fueled and armed. Kaga, 30. Soryu, 33. Further north, Hiryu counted 38. Fuel hoses snaked from plane to deck like silver serpents. Ordnance crews made final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mountings. Pilots sat in their cockpits, engines humming to life, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise had been circling endlessly, hunting for a Japanese fleet that refused to appear where it was expected. Low on fuel, McCluskey took a gamble. He followed a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. That single guess would place him directly above the Japanese carriers at the precise moment they were most vulnerable. At 10:22 a.m., 33 dive bombers pushed over from 14 to 500 feet. Below, the Zeros were at sea level, refueling. Anti-aircraft guns were trained horizontally to repel torpedoes. The decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. A powder keg waiting for a spark. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, chose Akagi as his target. In his after-action report, he wrote, "The carrier was turning into the wind, her deck packed with aircraft. I could see crew running, fuel hoses being dropped, aircraft trying to start engines. They had maybe 60 seconds warning, not nearly enough." At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck near the midship elevator of Akagi, detonating in the hangar amid stacked torpedoes and bombs, violations of every safety regulation imaginable. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove upon Kaga. 4 bombs hit in less than 30 seconds. The first struck forward, obliterating the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his staff instantly. The subsequent bombs slammed into the deck, triggering a chain reaction among the tightly packed aircraft. 80,000 tons of fuel, torpedoes, and bombs ignited in a cascading inferno. The heat was so intense that firefighting crews could not approach within 50 feet. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown arrived nearly simultaneously, targeting Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck in a perfect line down the flight deck. The first hit the forward hangar, the second amidships among aircraft. The third destroyed the rear elevator. Soryu's extra aviation fuel tanks, stored along the hangar deck to extend aircraft range, ruptured immediately, producing a firestorm exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. By 10:31 a.m., the American strike was over as suddenly as it had begun. In 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced from the most powerful warships afloat into burning hulks. On Akagi, Nagumo stood paralyzed on the bridge as explosions rocked the ship. Commander Oishi shouted damage report that seemed impossible. Flight deck destroyed, hangar deck ablaze, all aircraft lost, steering control lost, communications destroyed. Captain Taijiro Aoki grabbed Nagumo. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." On Kaga, the situation was even worse. The captain and senior officers had been killed instantly. Command fell to the damage control officer, trapped below decks by fire. Soryu burned fastest. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge even as flames encroached. His final order heard by survivors: "Save yourselves. I will remain with Soryu." He was last seen lashed to the helm, resolute to go down with his ship. Within minutes of 10:31 a.m., the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a catastrophe beyond anything in their experience. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been annihilated in less time than a single carrier landing operation. On Hiryu, the only surviving carrier, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched smoke columns rise from his 3 sister ships. The mathematics were catastrophic. In 11 minutes, Japan had lost 3 fleet carriers, roughly 110 aircraft on deck, 40-plus aircraft in hangars, 50-plus aircraft aloft with nowhere to land, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel. The devastation aboard the burning carriers was almost unimaginable. On Akagi, secondary explosions continued for hours, each sending sheets of steel through compartments packed with men. The hangar deck had become a crematorium. Kaga's immense size trapped hundreds below decks. The heat made rescue impossible, bulkheads glowing red. On Soryu, Commander Kondo survived to describe the engine room nightmare. The first bomb severed steam lines, releasing 400-degree superheated steam that killed men instantly. Others suffocated as the fire consumed all oxygen. Admiral Yamaguchi on Hiryu, facing near-certain destruction, reacted with characteristic aggression. Despite having only 1 carrier against 3 American ones, he immediately ordered a counterstrike. At 10:58 a.m., just 27 minutes after the American attack, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. They found Yorktown at noon. Despite radar-directed defenses and prepared American fighters, the Japanese veterans pressed their attack. 3 bombs striking Yorktown, igniting fires and damaging boilers. The American carrier slowed to a stop. Yamaguchi wasted no time, ordering a second strike. At 1:31 p.m., a tiny force of 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros launched from Hiryu. Against all odds, they found Yorktown again at 2:42 p.m. Despite the American ship's intense anti-aircraft fire, which destroyed half of the attackers, 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side. Leading this final desperate attack was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had spearheaded the morning Midway strike. His plane, already damaged over Midway, carried a leaking left-wing fuel tank. He knew he would not return, yet he pressed on. One of his torpedoes was among the 2 that found their mark. His aircraft plunged into the sea immediately after, a silent sacrifice for the mission. At 5:03 p.m., the inevitable occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found Hiryu. 4 bombs struck the last surviving Japanese carrier, transforming her into another towering inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku, mortally wounded, gave his final order: scuttle the ship, save the crew. Admiral Yamaguchi, resolute to the end, remained aboard. His final message to his staff was calm yet historic. "I will apologize to the Emperor for the defeat. You will rebuild the Navy." As the carriers burned, surviving Japanese officers slowly grasped the magnitude of the intelligence failure that had doomed them. The evidence was overwhelming. American carriers positioned with uncanny precision, Midway fully alerted, submarines strategically along approach routes, strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the right moment. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer of the combined fleet, would later write, "We realized the Americans had read our mail, every message, every order, every plan. We had been performing for an audience that already knew the script. The surprise we thought we possessed had actually belonged to them. The battle exposed truths about carrier warfare the Japanese had never fully understood. Their doctrine, massed carrier operations, coordinated strikes, holding reserves, had been sound, but under pressure, it faltered. American SPD Dauntless dive bombers proved superior to the famed Japanese VALs in the only metric that mattered, survivability while delivering ordnance. The American practice of keeping decks loaded for rapid launch rather than storing planes in hangars allowed faster strikes. And the meticulous American damage control once mocked had already saved Yorktown and would preserve other carriers for the remainder of the war. Night fell on June 4th. Thousands of Japanese sailors were adrift in the Pacific or crowded onto destroyers. The 3 destroyed carriers still floated, burning hulks on the horizon. Many sailors refused rescue, convinced they had failed the Emperor. Some swam away from lifelines, shouting, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years," then dove beneath the waves, holding their breath until death claimed them. The Americans, even as they won, did not immediately grasp the scope of their victory. Admiral Spruance, receiving reports of missing squadrons, calculated losses exceeding half his aircraft. Yorktown was crippled and listing. Japanese submarines were reported along every line of approach. Yet Spruance pressed on. By evening, his scouts located the burning Japanese carriers, confirming the monumental triumph. June 5th brought grim confirmation. The Japanese submarine I-168, dispatched by Yamamoto, found Yorktown under tow, barely moving. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown. 1 hit the destroyer Hammond alongside. Yorktown would sink on June 7th, the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then the outcome was irrevocable. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, scuttled by their own destroyers. When it became clear they could not be saved, the human toll continued to rise. Akagi burned for 19 hours before being scuttled at 5 a.m. on June 5th. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, taking 801 men. Soryu went under at 7:30 a.m. on June 4th with 701 souls. Hiryu lingered until 9 a.m. on June 5th, taking 392 men. The total death toll of 2,181 included not only sailors, but experienced mechanics, armorers, fuel handlers, and veteran pilots, the very core of Japan's naval aviation capability. Aboard the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier force, Admiral Yamamoto received the reports in silence. Commander Watanabe described the scene. The admiral sat motionless for nearly an hour, then said quietly, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." He understood what others would take months to realize. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers. In 6 months, it had lost 5. Replacements could be built, but not the trained crews. A carrier pilot required 2 years of training, a qualified aircraft mechanic 18 months, a flight deck crew 6 months of intensive drills. The math was unyielding. By the time Japan commissioned 1 new carrier, America had launched 17. By 1943, American pilot programs produced 10,000 pilots per month. Japan never exceeded 500 and could not replace its losses. The survivors of Midway bore psychological scars that would haunt the entire Japanese Navy. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The confidence that had driven operations from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon evaporated in 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. Lessons were learned too late. Combat air patrols would now always remain at altitude. Decks kept clear unless planes were immediately launching. Ordnance returned to magazines promptly. Search patterns overlapped. Radio silence partially abandoned for tactical communication. But these procedural fixes addressed symptoms, not the underlying cause. American intelligence, production, and innovation had already surpassed Japan. For the Americans, those 11 minutes transformed them. From defensive desperation, they became confident aggressors. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized at Pearl Harbor, realized it could not only fight the Japanese Navy, but destroy it. Admiral Nimitz, receiving confirmation of victory, told his staff, "They are not supermen. They can be beaten. They have been beaten. Now we take the offensive." The tactical lessons were immediate. Dive bombers were supreme ship killers, coordinated strikes ideal but not essential, and first strike advantage could decide battles. Radar-directed fighter control proved decisive. Damage control saved ships that seemed doomed, but the most enduring lesson of Midway was psychological. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8, who had floated in the Pacific watching the Japanese carriers burn, summed it up simply: "We had stood up to the best they had and destroyed it. After that, we knew we would win the war. It was just a matter of time and blood." Post-war analysis revealed the exact sequence of those 11 minutes in devastating detail. American dive bombers had achieved approximately a 52% hit rate at Midway, far above normal training statistics. And at precisely the right moment, the Japanese shot down 35 of 41 torpedo bombers, an 85% kill rate, yet those sacrificial attacks had created the conditions for the dive bombers' success. The carriers had been caught in what naval theorists call the vulnerable window. Aircraft being serviced, decks full, fuel hoses connected, ordnance exposed, attention elsewhere. All the elements that made a carrier almost helpless had aligned perfectly. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence officer whose codebreakers had made the ambush possible, later observed, "We won because we knew when they would be vulnerable, and we were lucky enough to catch them exactly then. 5 minutes earlier or later, and the battle ends differently." Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers rest in the deep waters of Midway, silent war graves for thousands. Oceanographer Robert Ballard located Yorktown at 16,650 feet and Kaga at 17,500 feet. Their hulks testify to those 11 decisive minutes. Recent expeditions in 2023 provided detailed surveys of these wrecks, now protected within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. Memorials were established on both sides, and at commemorations, former enemies met as friends, united in recognition of a battle that changed history. The Japanese Navy's attempt to hide Midway's outcome, quarantining survivors, swearing them to secrecy, claiming victory while concealing defeat, eroded morale across the fleet and set a pattern of deception that persisted until the war's end. Historians have endlessly debated how different those 11 minutes might have been if Tone's scout had launched on time, though ironically, modern research shows the delay may have helped the Japanese locate American forces earlier than they would have otherwise. If Nagumo had maintained a reserve strike, if the American torpedo bombers hadn't attacked, if McCluskey hadn't followed that destroyer. Yet history offers no alternative timelines. What happened in those 11 minutes changed everything. Modern military strategists continue to study Midway for lessons applicable to contemporary conflicts. Information dominance remains decisive. first strike advantage in high-technology warfare often determines outcomes. All military systems have moments of maximum vulnerability. Individual decisions under pressure can still determine the fate of entire fleets. Better systems often defeat better warriors. Letters, diaries, and interviews collected over decades reveal intimate portraits of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese accounts converge on the chaos, heroism, terror, and transformative impact of those moments. The U.S. Naval War College concluded, Midway's 11 minutes remain the gold standard for decisive military action. Never before or since has such a small window of time so completely reversed strategic reality. Economic historians estimate those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen in 1942 values, roughly 15% of its annual military budget. Indirect costs were far greater. Accelerated pilot training, reduced quality, resources were diverted from other projects, industrial capacity strained, and technical development rushed, leading to design flaws. America, by contrast, saw its war economy vindicated. Carriers lost at Midway were replaced within months, and the industrial machine that had seemed impossible to Japanese observers was only warming up. In Japanese culture, Midway became a metaphor for nemesis, the moment when hubris meets reality. The term Midway syndrome entered business vocabulary, describing overconfidence leading to catastrophic failure. Admiral Tanaka Raiso wrote after the war, "Those 11 minutes taught Japan that the age of the samurai was over. Individual courage, skill, and dedication meant nothing against systematic intelligence, overwhelming production, and technological superiority. We entered those 11 minutes as warriors. We emerged as anachronisms." Survivors on both sides bore unique psychological scars. American dive bomber pilots who had delivered death often suffered survivors' guilt. Japanese sailors who lived through the infernos endured shame for surviving when their ships perished. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb destroyed Akagi, never flew again due to tuberculosis exacerbated by caustic fumes from his oxygen system. He spent decades reflecting on the men killed by that single, perfectly placed bomb. "I did my duty, but duty does not ease the knowledge that my success meant death for hundreds of men doing their duty." Modern simulations have reconstructed those 11 minutes with astonishing precision, showing how narrow the margin was. A 5-minute delay, a 10-minute advance, a slightly lower cloud deck, a change in wind. Any could have prevented the dive bombers from striking with deadly effect. These simulations confirm that those 11 minutes represented the only window in a 2-hour period when the Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable, and the Americans struck it perfectly. Midway reshaped military doctrine worldwide. Information dominance, first strike advantage, timing, and the management of vulnerability remain central lessons. The battle demonstrated that even the most vaunted warriors can be undone by intelligence, preparation, and courage aligned in a fleeting moment. Those 11 minutes remain the ultimate testament to the decisive power of time, knowledge, and action. Carriers began operating in dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrols maintained multiple altitude layers continuously. Deck load strikes became standard, minimizing hangar exposure. Damage control became equally important as offensive capability. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with operations. The U.S. Navy completely rewrote its carrier warfare manual based on Midway's lessons. The Japanese Navy couldn't afford to implement the changes their analysis recommended. They lacked the resources to maintain constant air patrol or rapid rearmament capability. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made under extreme pressure. McCluskey's decision to follow the destroyer, Best's split-second choice of targets, Nagumo's fateful order to rearm, Spruance's calculated risk to launch at maximum range, individual pilots pressing attacks despite certain death. Admiral Spruance later reflected, "We won because our mistakes were recoverable, and theirs were not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese mistake was magnified. Every American gamble paid off. It wasn't justice or destiny. It was probability finally catching up with risk. At the 75th anniversary of Midway in 2017, the last surviving participants spoke at the commemoration. Their words captured the weight of those 11 minutes that had defined the rest of the 20th century. History remembers those 11 minutes as both glory and necessary horror. They defined not just a battle, but an era, proving that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition, training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of preparation. Between 10:20 and 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the trajectory of human history shifted. 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the instruments of Pacific conquest, the symbols of Japanese power, were transformed into burning wrecks. The American aircraft, launched in desperate, uncoordinated attacks, had achieved what seemed impossible: decisive victory against a superior force. Those 11 minutes proved that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter more than tradition, training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions at crucial moments can outweigh years of preparation. The Japanese pilots who had ruled Pacific skies for 6 months discovered in 11 minutes that their dominance was an illusion built on temporary advantage. The American pilots who had been dismissed as inferior discovered they could destroy the world's best naval force when circumstances aligned. In those 11 minutes, 2,181 Japanese sailors and airmen would eventually die on the 4 carriers, joining 307 Americans in transforming abstract strategic concepts into human tragedy. Their sacrifice, willing and unwilling, victorious and defeated, created the pivot point around which the Pacific War turned. The carriers that sank took with them not just steel and fuel and ammunition, but dreams of empire, assumptions of superiority, and confidence in destiny. They left behind widows who would never know how their husbands died, children who would grow up without fathers, and nations forced to confront the difference between mythology and reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests nearby, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same dark waters. They remain there as monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men died for causes they believed in, and when the modern world was born in violence that seemed endless but lasted less time than a coffee break. Those 11 minutes stand as history's most compressed lesson in the futility of military hubris, the power of intelligence and innovation, and the terrible cost of strategic miscalculation. They remind us that in warfare, as in life, everything can change in moments, that superiority is always temporary, and that the price of error is paid in blood. The last word belongs to Admiral Nagumo, who survived those 11 minutes but never recovered from them. Before his death on Saipan in 1944, he wrote, "At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by warriors, but by systems. In 11 minutes, the American system destroyed our warrior tradition. We thought we were fighting the last war better. They were fighting the next war first." Those 11 minutes were not a battle. They were an execution of obsolescence by innovation. The American aircraft launched while Japanese pilots had those 11 minutes changed more than the Pacific War. They changed how humanity would fight, think about, and remember conflict. In those 11 minutes, the age of the warrior ended and the age of the technologist began. The world has never been the same.